Hello and welcome. His travels take him to the most remote corners of the earth, and he explores regions many others have missed. But he's also on an active mission to preserve ancient traditions and cultures. This week on One-on-One, meet the Chinese-born explorer and conservationist, Wong How Man. Travel began quite early for this adventurer who says he felt something of a misfit in the colonial atmosphere of his birthplace, Hong Kong. Wong How Man left the colony to study photography in the US at the University of Wisconsin, but found himself in the middle of America's heated debate over the Vietnam War. Still, his persistent nature soon had him exploring remote locations for National Geographic, for whom he undertook a trek into the hinterlands of China. That eventually led him to proving the geography books wrong by identifying the true source of the mighty Yangtze River. Perhaps most importantly, he developed a passion for not only documenting, but helping to preserve ancient traditions and cultures. In 1987, he founded the China Exploration and Research Society to make sure that the living history of remote places doesn't disappear. How Man, it's great to speak with you. Thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you too.
Now, you've been described, Time magazine described you as China's greatest living explorer. You were honored in 2002 among their selection of 25 heroes of Asia, and you've certainly been on some remarkable adventures. So it makes me wonder, what drives you to explore?
Well, I've been always curious. I always felt that, perhaps, I haven't quite grown up. When people ask me what it takes to be an explorer, I said, you show me a 3-year-old kid and I show you an explorer. So I probably keep to at least the curiosity of a 3-year-old kid, and that's basically, I think that's the drive. I'm always very curious and inquisitive, and trying to seek the unknown.
So what skills make a good explorer?
I think one of the first rule of thumb is that you're willing to be lost. So I always tell people, as an explorer, you're not always hitting it right. So there's going to be a lot of surprises. And even though we set out with a goal, sometimes what's along the way came with so many surprises that actually at times it even surpassed your original goal.
You've covered a lot of ground geographically, of course, but I always wonder, with the amount of technology there is and the exploration that's been done, is there a lot left to discover?
Well, certainly, because I think, it's not only that as always, you need to be the first one there. I think these days with more technology, we can actually be access to much of the knowledge that's been gained before. So with our new modern viewpoint, we can reinterpret it. So I don't think it's only just bringing back content, but the context, the interpretation of what we see. So of course, there are cases that we are actually being the first one, let's say, to define certain aspect, like, we've defined the source of the Yangtze, the Mekong, and the Yellow River. But, it's not always like that.
You're unique, though, in that you like to not only get to remote places, but to leave them in better condition than when you left. And it's a kind of, improving the world in which you live in and which you visit. So what motivates that?
Well, I think that's one of the watershed in my earlier career as a journalist and explorer, is that I used to make discoveries, write about it, share it with the rest of the world. And then next time I go around and you see it disintegrating, vanishing. A lot of those are, of course, part of the natural process of evolution and modernization. But at the same time, many of these cultural and natural heritage, I think in order to preserve it, though in some cases we can actually help maintain it. So, that's why I move beyond just exploration into conservation to culture and nature. In particular, of course, I work mainly in China, western part of China, remote parts of China. And in those days that I started working 35 years ago, China has that fairly low in their priority. It's not a powerhouse. It's not a wealthy nation. Economically, it's quite backward. And of course, things are changing. These days, of course, they should take those into the forefront. Their educated young people are also engaging in conservation.
There's two sides of to the story, though, isn't there? There's the side of allowing the world to discover this part of remote China, for example, that you're exploring and getting them better aware of what's going on there and the people there. And then there's getting the people who live in those remote areas to better understand their environment and look after it more, isn't there?
That's right. I think in the process of conserving these, they also find their own, let's say, their own national integrity, their own cultural diversity. At times, of course, because they've been economically in the backwaters, it takes them time to look at those that when an outsider really appreciate it and even come in with resources to preserve it, it actually help their own identity and their own integrity.
Now, it seems that you're willing to make a little trouble from time to time with the philosophy that sometimes it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. And I wonder, is that how you manage to get around some of the bureaucracy, especially in China, that you come across?
Yes, in the early years, definitely within the first 20 years, that it's if you're waiting for all the paperwork to get through, you won't get anything done. And very early on, I've learned not to take simply no is not an answer. You always can get around it. And of course, in our projects, a lot of times we deliver results fairly quickly. So by the time they find out, actually, they can see the results a little bit already. So the apology will come easier. They can actually see, oh, you have a good intention.
Now, you were born in Hong Kong at a time when it was very much a British colony. What do you remember of those early years then?
Well, I went to a Christian elementary school and then a Jesuit high school. So it's very regimented, and I think the kind of education we provide, we're provided with, it's actually quite good, but it's geared towards everybody in the mainstream. So you're becoming a doctor, an engineer, or a scholar, or whatever. And very early on, I've been fairly rebellious, so whatever way I can get away with, I try to do that. So I think, I very early on tried to break away from the norm. And of course, I keep one foot in the door such that I'm not a total outcast. It was a Jesuit high school, it's not easy to get through. So I just do all the bare minimum and spend the rest of the time looking at things that are of interest to myself.
What about your parents? How did they influence you? What sort of upbringing did you have under their sort of influence?
Well, my father has always been teaching science. So, all along he was hoping that, we either become doctors or engineers or become a scientist. So I was actually, when I applied to university here in Wisconsin in the US, I was admitted in chemistry. But once I get down to campus and realize that, hey, it's not like in Hong Kong that you're stuck with what you pick. Within the first quarter, I changed to journalism and art. And of course, I'm thousands of miles away. You can't really look over my shoulder anymore. So I departed on a whole different journey that is really basically what I want to seek for myself.
What was the reaction when news got back home?
Oh, God. In those days, you don't get to go home flying back and forth. I didn't, first 3 years, I didn't get to go home, so I was, but the worst part was that, I felt that, I was there to learn something of my own interest. So by the time I got to fourth year, near graduation, the last course, I took an incomplete and left. It was a press law in journalism. And he didn't find out. I got a job offer already. I started working. 2 years later, when we received a letter from the school asking why I didn't finish, and he was, of course, very upset. So I turned in my last paper and got my degree, and I've never seen my diploma again. I gave it to him.
What about your mother? How did she influence you?
Well, the most important part that I think my mother influenced me was that she's fiercely independent. So even growing up, despite that it's a very traditional family, my grandfather was a comprador, and so it's a business family. And I can recall that by the time I'm a teenager, when we have family gatherings, be it lunch or dinner, and I'm always getting bored there and I want to get out. And whenever she felt that I wants to get away, she would just rush me along and said, don't worry. So same like later years when I go out into the remote areas to explore, she always don't want to be a liability. She prepare herself very well and always just let me be able to go without having to worry about anything that's left behind. So I think that through my formative years as well as later years, how she was able to allow me to do what I do is just don't feel that we have to be responsible for her.
Now, with your life growing up in what was very strongly influenced British environment too, did that British culture, the colonial culture, clash in any way with what you were experiencing through your Chinese influence?
I think definitely, because growing up, we weren't taught very much about Chinese, contemporary Chinese history. So everything about the further back in history, yes, but once you get into, let's say, the last Manchu dynasty by the Opium War, things become very opaque, and we really don't get any of those education. So it wasn't until I went to America when I, first of all, when I was in Wisconsin, you really feel that you're a minority, you feel differently from everyone else. In Hong Kong, it's 98% Chinese. So you never question your own identity. So it was when I was in college that I start realizing, hey, I'm very different from everybody else. Then you start going to the library and seek out books to read about the contemporary Chinese history or about Chinese culture. And then suddenly I realized that many of the books are very old and out of date because there was a big gap dealing with modern China. And that's why as soon as I graduated in 1973, I went to China during the Cultural Revolution.
And of course, you were in America at a time when the Vietnam War was a big issue.
And that's right. I think that also got a major influence on me because I was in journalism school and art school, and both of those departments are fairly progressive. I want some margin of being radical, and campuses all over America at that time was having strikes or protests, and a lot of our fellow students are veterans coming back from the Vietnam War. So I think it affected me later on about the thinking process, and always. I won't say intellectualizing it, but at least challenging the mainstream beliefs. And we want to look at, well, what about the other side of the story?
Well, How Man, I know you have an interesting tale when it took off as you started exploring. We'll get to that in a moment. We take a short break here with One on One. We'll be right back.